The willow tree was dying, and it was taking Margaret Fletcher with it. For 20 years, that ancient tree had been slowly withering away, its branches growing bare, its leaves turning black with disease. The neighbors thought it was just old age. The town council thought it was neglect. But Ben Torres knew better. Trees don't just die for no reason. Especially not trees that have stood for over a century, trees that have witnessed generations of love and laughter and life. Something was killing this willow from the inside out. Something that had nothing to do with fungus or drought or time. It was grief. The same grief that had turned a once vibrant woman into a bitter recluse. The same grief that had driven away everyone she loved. The same grief that had been feeding the tree-poisoned roots for 2 decades, slowly choking the life out of both of them. But Ben discovered something impossible. The tree remembered everything. Every picnic. Every laugh. Every carved initial and pressed handprint. And more importantly, it remembered the words that shattered a family 20 years ago, words so cruel they'd driven a 17-year-old girl away forever. Now Ben has to decide, does he tell Maggie what the tree showed him? Does he risk reopening wounds that never really healed? Does he dare to believe that some things, no matter how broken, can still be saved? Because here's the truth nobody wants to admit, we're all like that willow tree. We carry our pain in our roots, let it feed on us from the inside, until one day we look up and realize we're dying. But what if healing was possible? What if it wasn't too late? This is the story of how one dying tree brought a family back to life. The willow tree was dying, and Margaret Fletcher couldn't have cared less. At least, that's what she told herself every morning when she looked out her bedroom window and saw another branch drooping, another cluster of leaves turning brown before their time. The ancient tree stood in the center of her property like a skeletal finger pointing at the sky, accusing her of something she refused to name. 72 years old, and Maggie had perfected the art of not caring. She wore it like armor, polished and impenetrable. Her Victorian mansion sat on 3 acres at the edge of Millbrook, a house that had once been the envy of the town. Now the paint peeled in long strips, the garden beds choked with weeds, and the iron fence rusted at its posts. The neighbors complained. The town council sent letters. Maggie threw them in the fireplace and watched them burn. She liked watching things burn. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when the knock came. Maggie ignored it. She always ignored knocks. But this one persisted, steady and patient, the kind of knock that suggested the person on the other side had nowhere else to be and nothing to lose. Finally, she yanked open the door. A young man stood on her porch, maybe late 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and work boots that had seen better days. He held a worn clipboard and wore a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Maggie recognized that smile. It was the smile of someone who needed something and hated having to ask. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said. "Miss," she snapped. "And whatever you're selling, I don't want it." "I'm not selling anything. I'm Ben Torres, from Torres Landscaping. The town council sent me about your property." Maggie's jaw tightened. "Did they now?" "Yes, ma'am. There's been some concern about the willow tree. It appears to be diseased, and there are regulations about dying trees on properties this close to the road. I'm here to give you an estimate for treatment or removal." "Removal?" Maggie laughed, a sound like gravel scraping glass. "You want to cut down a tree that's been here longer than you've been alive." "I don't want to cut down anything," Ben said, and there was something in his voice that made Maggie actually look at him. Tired. He sounded tired. "I'd prefer to save it, if possible. But I need to examine it first. May I come in?" Maggie studied him for a long moment. His jacket was frayed at the cuffs. His truck in the driveway was at least 15 years old, the logo on the side faded almost to nothing. Torres Landscaping. She remembered that name. There used to be a Torres who did work around town, good work, before he died. This must be his son. She stepped aside. "Make it quick." Ben followed her through the house, and Maggie saw him trying not to stare at the dust-covered furniture, the cobwebs in the corners, The photographs turned face down on every surface. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't owe him one. The backyard was worse than the front. What had once been a magnificent English garden was now a tangle of overgrown roses and collapsed trellises. But the willow tree dominated everything, massive and ancient, its drooping branches forming a curtain around a trunk so wide 3 men couldn't encircle it. Ben walked toward it slowly, reverently, the way someone might approach a cathedral. "How old is this tree?" he asked. "Over 100 years, Maggie said. "Planted by my husband's grandfather." She watched as Ben circled the trunk, running his hands over the bark, tilting his head back to examine the canopy. More than half the branches were bare, and the leaves that remained were spotted with black fungus. He pulled out a knife and carefully scraped a small section of bark, examining the wood beneath. "It's sick," he said quietly. "But not dead. Not yet. Does it matter?" Ben turned to look at her, and Maggie felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest. His eyes were brown and direct, and they saw too much. "Yes," he said. "It matters." He moved around to the side of the trunk facing the house, where the bark was smoothest. Then he stopped. Maggie knew what he'd found even before he spoke. "There are initials here," Ben said. "MF and RF. And a handprint. Small, like a child's." "I told you to examine the tree, not interrogate it," Maggie snapped. "Can you save it or not?" Ben was quiet for a moment, still looking at the carved letters. Then he pulled out his clipboard and started making notes. "I can try," he said. "It'll take time. The fungus needs to be treated, the dead branches removed carefully so we don't stress the tree further. The soil needs amendment. And it needs water, proper water, not whatever it's been getting." "Fine. How much?" Ben did some calculations, his pencil scratching across the paper. Maggie saw him hesitate, saw him erase a number and write a smaller one. Something hot and ugly rose in her throat. "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't give me a discount because you think I'm some pathetic old woman. Your father's business was second-rate, and I'm sure yours is no better. If you can't charge what the work is worth, you shouldn't be doing it at all." The words hung in the air like poison. Ben's face went carefully blank, and Maggie felt a savage satisfaction. There. That's what she did. That's what she was good at. Pushing people away before they could leave on their own. Ben put his clipboard under his arm. His hands, Maggie noticed, were shaking slightly. "My father," he said, his voice very controlled, "built his business on integrity. He worked himself sick trying to keep it going after my mother died, because he knew people in this town depended on him. He died 2 years ago, and I've been trying to honor what he built ever since. So you can insult me all you want, Mrs. Fletcher, but don't you dare insult him." He walked past her toward the house. Maggie stood frozen by the willow tree, something cold spreading through her chest. She wanted to call him back. She wanted to apologize. The words stuck in her throat like splinters. She followed him through the house and found him at the front door, his hand on the knob. "The estimate is $1,200, he said without looking at her. "That's for treatment, not removal. If you want the tree to live, that's what it'll cost. I'll email the detailed breakdown to the address the town council gave me." "Wait," Maggie heard herself say. Ben paused. "Can you start tomorrow?" He turned slowly, surprise flickering across his face. "You want me to do the work? After what you just said? I want the tree treated. Whether you're the one who does it or not makes no difference to me. But you're here now, and I don't want to waste time finding someone else." It was possibly the worst acceptance of a job offer in history, and they both knew it. But something passed between them in that moment, some wordless understanding. Ben needed the work. Maggie needed the tree saved, even if she couldn't admit why. "I'll be here at 8, Ben said. After he left, Maggie stood in her empty hallway for a long time. Then she walked back out to the willow tree and placed her palm against the trunk, right over the carved initials. The bark was rough and warm from the afternoon sun. MF and RF forever, she whispered. Robert had carved those letters 45 years ago, on their 5th wedding anniversary. They'd had a picnic under the willow's branches that day, just the two of them and their daughter. Iris had been 7, all wild curls and bright laughter, and she'd pressed her little hand into the soft bark while the sap was still wet, leaving an impression that would last forever. Forever. What a lie that word had turned out to be. Robert died when Iris was 15. A heart attack, sudden and brutal, no warning. One day he was there, solid and real and alive. The next day he was gone, and Maggie's world collapsed into a black hole of grief so consuming she couldn't see anything else. Not the daughter who needed her. Not the friends who tried to help. Not the life that continued stubbornly moving forward without him. She'd turned her grief into rage, and her rage into cruelty. Every time she looked at Iris, she saw Robert's eyes, Robert's smile, and the pain was unbearable. So she'd lashed out, criticized, belittled, pushed away. The day Iris left was burned into Maggie's memory. Her daughter had been 17, standing in this very yard with a backpack and tears streaming down her face. "Why do you hate me?" Iris had asked. "What did I do?" And Maggie, drowning in her own pain, had said the words that would haunt her for the next 20 years. "You're just like your father. Weak. Destined to disappoint me." Iris had left that night. No note. No goodbye. Just gone. That was 20 years ago. 20 years of silence. 20 years of Maggie telling herself she was better off alone, that she didn't need anyone, that caring about people only led to pain. 20 years of the willow tree slowly dying. Maggie pulled her hand away from the bark and walked back to her empty house. She didn't look at the photographs she'd turned face down. She didn't look at the dust-covered furniture that no one sat in anymore. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, lay down on top of the covers, and stared at the ceiling until the sun went down and the room filled with shadows. The next morning, Ben's truck pulled into the driveway at exactly 8 o'clock. Maggie watched from her bedroom window as he unloaded equipment from the back. His tools looked old but well-maintained, and he moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd been doing this work his whole life. She thought about his father, about what Ben had said. Worked himself sick trying to keep the business going. She wondered what that kind of dedication looked like, what it felt like to care about something that much. She used to know. Once. Ben worked all morning, and Maggie pretended not to watch him. She made tea she didn't drink and rearranged books she never read and told herself she didn't care what he was doing out there. But every so often, she'd glance out the window and see him pruning dead branches with surgical precision, or mixing something in a large bucket, or standing very still with his hand on the trunk of the willow tree, his head tilted like he was listening to something. At noon, she brought him a glass of water. She didn't know why. It just seemed like something a person should do. Ben was on a ladder, carefully examining a high branch. He climbed down when he saw her. "Thank you," he said, taking the glass. His hands were covered in scratches, and there was tree sap in his hair. "How bad is it?" Maggie asked. Ben drank half the water before answering. "The fungus is worse than I thought. But the tree is a fighter. It wants to live. Trees don't want things. Don't they?" Ben looked back at the willow. "This tree has been here for over a century. It's weathered storms, droughts, disease. It's watched generations of your family grow up in its shade. That takes a certain stubbornness, don't you think?" Maggie didn't answer. She turned to go back inside. "Mrs. Fletcher," Ben called after her. She stopped but didn't turn around. "The initials on the trunk. RF, was that your husband?" "Yes." "And the handprint?" "My daughter." The words came out flat, hard. End of discussion. But Ben, apparently, didn't understand social cues. Or maybe he understood them perfectly and chose to ignore them. "Where is she now?" he asked. Maggie turned then, and the look she gave him would have withered flowers. "That," she said, her voice like ice, "is none of your concern. Do your work, Mr. Torres. That's what I'm paying you for. Not conversation. She walked back to the house and slammed the door behind her. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the kitchen counter and took deep breaths until the shaking stopped. That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the willow tree, about Ben's words. The tree wants to live. What a foolish, sentimental notion. And yet, at 2 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs. She walked out into the backyard in her nightgown and slippers, guided by moonlight. The willow tree stood silent and still, its branches hanging down like a veil. Maggie stepped through the curtain of leaves and sat down with her back against the trunk, in the exact spot where they used to have picnics. Robert would bring sandwiches and Iris would bring her collection of stuffed animals, and they'd spend entire afternoons here, laughing and talking and just being together. Being happy. The memory was so sharp it felt like a knife. "I'm sorry," Maggie whispered to the tree. To Robert. To Iris. To herself. "I'm so sorry." The wind moved through the branches, rustling the few remaining leaves, and just for a moment, just for a heartbeat, Maggie could have sworn she heard a whisper in response. It sounded like forgiveness. Ben Torres had been working on the willow tree for 3 days when he first heard the whispers. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, while he was treating the fungus on the upper branches. The wind had died completely, leaving the air hot and still, but the willow's leaves rustled anyway. Soft. Persistent. Like someone trying to get his attention. Ben paused, brush in hand, and listened. At first, he thought it was just the tree settling, the natural creaking and shifting of old wood. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. Not words exactly, but something close. A feeling that pressed against his mind like fingers against glass, asking to be let in. He climbed down from the ladder and stood at the base of the trunk, one hand resting on the bark. The carved initials were warm beneath his palm. "You're losing it," he muttered to himself. 3 days of Maggie Fletcher's hospitality and you're already going crazy. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. Ben had always had an unusual relationship with plants. His father used to joke that Ben could hear what trees needed, that he had some kind of sixth sense for sick roots or struggling branches. Ben had laughed it off, attributed his success to careful observation and years of experience. But standing here now, under the willow's canopy, he wasn't so sure. The tree wanted to show him something. He closed his eyes and let himself listen, really listen, not with his ears but with that deeper sense his father had recognized. And suddenly, like flipping through pages in a book, images flooded his mind. A young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, maybe 30 years old, laughing as a man lifted her and spun her around beneath the willow's branches. The man set her down and kissed her, gentle and sure, and the woman's joy was so pure it made Ben's chest ache. He watched as the man pulled out a pocket knife and carefully carved letters into the bark. MF and RF forever. The woman traced the letters with her finger and smiled like she'd been given the world. The image shifted, moved forward in time. The same couple, older now, with a little girl between them. The child couldn't have been more than 7, all tangled curls and gap-toothed grin. She was pressing her hand into the bark, giggling as the sap stuck to her fingers. The man, Robert, Ben somehow knew his name was Robert, hoisted the girl onto his shoulders while the woman, Maggie, younger Maggie, softer Maggie, spread a blanket for a picnic. They were so happy it hurt to watch. More images, faster now. The little girl growing up. Birthday parties under the willow. Summer afternoons reading books in the shade. A tire swing hanging from the strongest branch, spinning in circles while the girl shrieked with laughter. This tree had held so much joy, had witnessed so much love, that it soaked into the wood like water into roots. Then the images turned dark. Ben saw Robert collapse in the kitchen, clutching his chest. Saw Maggie's face crumble as paramedics shook their heads. Saw the funeral, the black clothes, the way Maggie stood alone and separate even in a crowd of mourners. And then he saw what came after. The girl, teenager now, trying to talk to her mother. Maggie turning away, her face a mask of stone. The girl crying, pleading. Maggie's mouth moving, words Ben couldn't hear but could feel, sharp and cutting. The girl running, packing a bag, leaving in the middle of the night. Maggie watching from a window, not calling her back, just standing there as her daughter disappeared into the darkness. And then nothing. Just Maggie, alone in that big house, year after year, season after season, letting the garden die, letting the paint peel, letting the willow tree slowly wither because she was withering too, from the inside out. Ben opened his eyes, gasping. His hand was still on the trunk, and tears he didn't remember shedding were wet on his cheeks. "Jesus," he whispered. He understood now. The tree wasn't just sick from fungus or neglect. It was sick from grief. It had absorbed Maggie's pain the way its roots absorbed water, and that pain was killing it from the inside out. Ben looked up at the house and saw Maggie watching him from a second-floor window. Even from this distance, he could see the rigid line of her shoulders, the way she held herself like a soldier at attention. So much armor. So much fear underneath. He made a decision that would change everything. That evening, after Maggie had paid him for the day and retreated into her fortress of a house, Ben sat in his truck and wrote on a piece of notebook paper. His handwriting was terrible, always had been, but he wrote carefully, wanting to get it right. "Dear Maggie," he wrote, then crossed it out. Too familiar. "Dear Mrs. Fletcher." He tried again. Too formal. Finally, he just started writing. "There was a day in May, 38 years ago, when Robert carved your initials into my bark. You wore a yellow dress and laughed when he spelled forever wrong the first time and had to start over. You told him that forever wasn't long enough. Do you remember?" Ben signed it from the Willow and left it wedged in the front door before he drove away. He half expected Maggie to fire him the next day. Instead, when he arrived, the note was gone and Maggie was nowhere to be seen. He worked all morning without interruption, treating the fungus, amending the soil, carefully removing dead wood while leaving the living branches untouched. At lunch, he wrote another note. "Iris was 5 when she planted her first flower under my branches. It was a petunia, pink and purple, and she watered it every single day that summer. When it bloomed, she picked the first flower and brought it to you. You tucked it behind your ear and told her she was your sunshine. She never forgot that." He left this note on the back porch, weighed down with a stone. The next morning, both notes were gone. Maggie still didn't speak to him, but Ben noticed changes. She started sitting on the back porch in the late afternoon, just sitting, staring at the willow tree. Once, he saw her reach up and touch her ear, right where a flower might have been tucked, and something in her face cracked open before she slammed it shut again. Ben kept writing. "Robert proposed to you under my branches on a night when the fireflies were so thick they looked like stars. He was nervous and dropped the ring twice. You laughed and told him yes before he even finished asking. That was the first time I ever heard you say you were happy. Iris learned to read sitting against my trunk. She read Charlotte's Web 7 times the summer she was 8. You sat with her every afternoon, and when she got to the sad parts, you held her while she cried. You told her it was okay to cry for things you loved. The day Iris left, I heard what you said to her. But I also heard what you didn't say. That you were terrified of losing her the way you lost Robert. That watching her grow up hurt because she looked so much like him. That you thought pushing her away would hurt less than having her leave on her own. You were wrong." Ben wasn't sure where the words came from. The tree showed him the memories, but the insights felt like they came from somewhere deeper, some understanding that transcended what he could see. Maybe the willow really was whispering to him. Maybe he was just a tired landscaper who'd watched his own father work himself to death and recognized the shape of regret when he saw it. Either way, he kept writing. After a week of notes, Ben arrived one morning to find Maggie sitting under the willow tree. Not on the porch, not watching from the window, but actually sitting on the ground with her back against the trunk, exactly where he'd seen her in the tree's memories. She didn't look at him as he approached, but she didn't leave either. "These notes," she said, her voice rough. "How do you know these things?" Ben set down his equipment and sat across from her, careful to leave space between them. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But the tree does. It remembers everything. Trees don't remember. This one does." Maggie was quiet for a long time. Above them, the willow's branches swayed even though there was no wind. "The note from yesterday," she said finally. "About what I said to Iris. How could you possibly know that?" The tree heard it. "And it's been carrying that pain ever since, just like you have." "That's insane." "Maybe." Ben pulled up a handful of grass and let it fall through his fingers. "Or maybe pain is just another thing that grows, if you feed it long enough. You've been feeding yours for 20 years. The tree's been dying for 20 years. You think that's a coincidence?" Maggie's hands were clenched in her lap, white-knuckled. "She was 17, she whispered. "Just 17. And I told her she was weak. That she disappointed me. What kind of mother says that to her child?" "A mother who was drowning," Ben said quietly. "A mother who didn't know how to swim." "That's no excuse." "No, it's not. But maybe it's a starting place." Maggie looked at him then, really looked at him, and Ben saw past the armor to the woman underneath. She was terrified. Not of him, not of the tree, but of the possibility that it might be too late, that some things couldn't be fixed, that some words once spoken could never be taken back. "I don't even know where she is," Maggie said. "I don't know if she's happy or sad or married or has children or what she does for a living. I don't know anything about my own daughter's life. Do you want to?" The question hung in the air between them. Maggie closed her eyes. "Every single day," she breathed. "Every single day for 20 years. Ben thought about the box of his father's papers he'd been going through, the letters and invoices and business cards accumulated over 40 years of running a landscaping company. His father had known everyone in this town, had worked on nearly every property. If anyone had information about Iris Fletcher, it would be in those files. "Let me see what I can find," he said. That afternoon, Ben went through his father's records. It took hours, sorting through decades of paperwork, but finally he found it. An invoice from 15 years ago for a property in Riverside, 3 towns over. The name on the invoice was Iris Fletcher Morrison. His father had planted a garden for her new house, had made notes in his careful handwriting. "Customer wants forget-me-nots and lavender. Reminds her of her childhood home." Ben stared at that last line for a long time. Reminds her of her childhood home. Even after everything, even after running away and changing her name and building a new life, Iris had wanted something to remember. That had to mean something. He found her address through the county records. Then he did something that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. He wrote her a letter. "Dear Iris," he wrote. "You don't know me. My name is Ben Torres, and I'm working on your mother's property. The willow tree is dying. I think you should know. I think maybe you should come see it one last time. Whatever happened between you and your mother, the tree remembers the good times too. It remembers a little girl who planted petunias and read books in the shade and pressed her hand into the bark because she wanted to leave her mark on something permanent. That mark is still there. You're still there. And I think the tree is waiting for you to come home." He included his phone number and mailed the letter before he could change his mind. Then he went back to Maggie's property and kept working. The fungus treatment was showing results. New growth appeared on branches that had looked dead. The leaves that remained were greener, healthier. The tree was responding to care the way all living things did, with stubborn resilience and hope. Ben started spending his lunch breaks sitting under the willow, and sometimes Maggie would join him. They didn't talk much. Mostly they just sat in comfortable silence, listening to the whispers in the leaves. But slowly, carefully, Maggie began to share memories. She told him about meeting Robert at a county fair when she was 19. About their wedding in this very yard, under this very tree. About the day Iris was born and how Robert had cried so hard the nurses thought something was wrong. about the 1,000 small moments that made up a marriage, a family, a life. And Ben listened, the way his father had taught him to listen. Not just to the words, but to the spaces between them, the things left unsaid, the grief that ran underneath everything like an underground river. "I thought if I didn't love anything, I couldn't lose anything," Maggie said one afternoon. They were sitting under the willow, watching clouds drift across a blue sky. "I thought I was protecting myself. But I just ended up alone." "You're not alone right now," Ben pointed out. Maggie smiled, just a little. It was the first time Ben had seen her smile, and it transformed her face completely. For just a moment, he could see the young woman from the tree's memories, the one who laughed and tucked flowers behind her ear and said forever wasn't long enough. "No," she agreed. "I suppose I'm not." That evening, Ben's phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello. Is this Ben Torres?" A woman's voice, careful and controlled. "Yes. This is Iris Morrison. I got your letter about the willow tree." Ben's heart started racing. "Thank you for calling." "I need you to understand something," Iris said. "I left for a reason. My mother made it very clear that I wasn't welcome in her life. I built a new life for myself, a good life, and I'm not sure I want to dredge up the past." "I understand. But," Iris continued, and Ben heard something shift in her voice. "That tree. I used to sit under it for hours. It was my favorite place in the world. And if it's really dying, if this is the last chance to see it, I don't know. Maybe I need closure." "It's not just the tree that needs closure," Ben said gently. Iris was quiet for so long he thought she'd hung up. Then, "Is she really that bad?" "My mother. She's that lonely," Ben said. "There's a difference." Another long pause. "I have a son. He's 6. His name is Oliver. She doesn't even know he exists." Ben thought about Maggie sitting alone in that big house, surrounded by turned-down photographs and dust-covered furniture. He thought about 20 years of regret, of words that couldn't be unsaid, of time that couldn't be recovered. "She should know," he said. "You both should know each other. Before it's really too late." "You don't understand what she said to me." "You're right. I don't. But I do understand that people say terrible things when they're drowning. And I understand that your mother has been drowning for 20 years. Maybe it's time someone threw her a rope." Iris didn't commit to anything, but she didn't say no either. She took Ben's number and said she'd think about it. Ben didn't tell Maggie about the call. Some hopes were too fragile to share. He kept working on the tree, kept leaving notes, kept sitting with Maggie in the afternoons. And slowly, day by day, the willow began to heal. New leaves unfurled. Branches that had been bare showed signs of life. It was subtle, incremental, but undeniable. The tree wanted to live. 2 weeks after he'd mailed the letter, Ben arrived at the property to find an unfamiliar car in the driveway. His heart stopped. He'd told Iris to call first if she decided to come, but maybe she'd wanted the element of surprise. Maybe she'd wanted to see her mother's reaction without giving her time to prepare. Ben walked around to the backyard and stopped dead. Maggie stood 30 feet away, frozen, staring at a woman who stood under the willow tree. The woman had dark hair streaked with gray and Maggie's exact profile. She held the hand of a small boy with bright, curious eyes. Iris had come home. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the whisper of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a bird. Ben held his breath, afraid that if he moved, the spell would break and Iris would run, and the chance would be lost forever. Then Maggie took one step forward. Just one. Her mouth opened like she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Her hand lifted, reaching toward her daughter, then fell back to her side. Iris stood very still, her face a careful mask. But Ben saw her fingers tighten on her son's hand. The little boy, Oliver, had no such reservations. He looked up at his mother and said, in the clear, carrying voice of children everywhere, "Mommy, is that her? Is that Grandma?" The word hung in the air like a bell ringing. Grandma. A title Maggie had never heard, never expected to hear, had given up hoping to hear. Something in Maggie's face collapsed. Not her armor, that stayed mostly intact. But something deeper, something she'd been holding rigid for so long that letting it go was almost painful to watch. Iris, she whispered. Just the name, nothing else, but it carried 20 years of grief and regret and desperate, terrified hope. Iris took a shaky breath. Her eyes were wet. "Hi, Mom," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. They stood there, mother and daughter, separated by 20 years and 30 feet and an ocean of unsaid words. Neither of them moved. Neither of them seemed capable of movement. So Oliver, bless him, made the decision for them. He pulled his hand free from his mother's grip and ran across the grass to Maggie, throwing his arms around her legs and hugging her with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a 6-year-old who'd been told he had a grandmother and saw no reason not to love her immediately. Maggie looked down at the small boy clinging to her and burst into tears. Ben had never seen her cry, had never imagined she was capable of it. But watching her now, watching her kneel down and gather this child she'd never met into her arms and sob into his hair, Ben had to turn away to give them privacy for something so raw. When he looked back, Iris was walking toward her mother. Not running. Walking. Each step deliberate, like she was crossing a bridge she wasn't sure would hold her weight. But she kept walking, and when she reached Maggie, when they stood face to face for the first time in 20 years, something shifted in the air around them. The willow tree's branches swayed, and Ben heard it again. The whispers. But this time they didn't sound like grief. They sounded like relief. Maggie didn't know what to say. 20 years of imagined conversations, of rehearsed apologies and explanations, and now that Iris stood in front of her, every word evaporated like morning dew. So she said nothing. She just looked at her daughter and tried to memorize everything. The lines at the corners of Iris's eyes. The silver threading through her dark hair. The way she stood with her weight on one hip, protective and uncertain. She was 45 years old, and Maggie had missed all of it. Every birthday. Every milestone. Every ordinary Tuesday afternoon that made up a life. Oliver squirmed in Maggie's arms, and she reluctantly let him go. He immediately grabbed her hand and started tugging. "Come see the tree, Grandma. Mr. Ben says it's very old and it remembers things." "Can trees really remember?" "Mommy says they can't, but Mr. Ben says this one does." Maggie looked at Ben, who stood awkwardly by his equipment like he wasn't sure whether to leave or stay. She gave him a small nod. "Stay. Please stay. Trees remember in their own way," Maggie told Oliver, letting him pull her toward the willow. "This tree has been here longer than I've been alive. Longer than your mommy's been alive. It's seen a lot." "Did you play here when you were little?" Oliver asked. "No, but your mother did. She spent hours here, reading and playing and getting into mischief." Iris followed behind them, her arms wrapped around herself. "I can't believe it's still here. I thought maybe you'd cut it down after I left." "Why would I cut it down?" Maggie asked, and immediately regretted the sharp edge in her voice. "Old habits." "Because I know you hated being reminded," Iris said quietly. "Of Dad. Of before. Of everything good that you lost." Maggie stopped walking. Oliver tugged at her hand, but she stayed rooted to the spot, looking at her daughter. "I never hated being reminded," she said. "I hated that the reminders hurt so much. There's a difference." They reached the willow and Oliver immediately found the carved initials, running his small fingers over the letters the way Iris used to do. "MF and RF, he read slowly. "Who's RF?" Iris knelt beside her son. "That was your grandfather. Robert Fletcher. He died before you were born." "Before I was born. That was a really long time ago." "Yes," Iris said, her voice thick. "It was." Oliver touched the small handprint pressed into the bark below the initials. "And this? Whose hand is this?" "That's mine," Iris said. I was 7 years old. My dad helped me make it. It's so small. Oliver pressed his own hand next to it, comparing sizes. I'm bigger than you were. Maggie watched them, this grandson she'd never met and this daughter she'd driven away, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not painfully, though it should have been painful. More like ice breaking up in spring, making way for something new to grow. There's room for yours too, Maggie heard herself say. If you want. Next to your mother's. Oliver looked up at Iris, who looked at Maggie with an expression so complicated it was impossible to read. Surprise. Suspicion. Hope. Hurt. Everything at once. Can I, Mommy? Oliver asked. Iris hesitated, then nodded. Okay. Ben stepped forward. I've got a pocket knife. We can do it carefully, make sure we don't hurt the tree. He showed Oliver how to press his hand flat against the bark, traced around it lightly with the tip of the knife, then let Oliver help carve out the impression while Ben did most of the actual work. Maggie watched, transfixed, as 3 generations of handprints lined up on the willow's trunk. Iris at 7. Oliver at 6. A family tree written in flesh and bark. When it was done, Oliver traced all 3 prints with his finger, from smallest to largest, then looked at Maggie. Where's yours, Grandma? I don't have one. Why not? Because I never thought to make one. You should make one now, Oliver said with the simple logic of children. Then we'll all be here together. Maggie looked at Iris, who was very carefully not looking at anyone. Then she looked at Ben, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked at the willow tree, at the initials Robert had carved so many years ago, at the handprints of her daughter and grandson. All right, she said. All right. She pressed her hand against the bark next to Oliver's, and Ben carefully traced around it. The knife bit into the wood with small, precise cuts, and Maggie felt each one like it was cutting into her own skin. When it was done, all 4 impressions lined up in a row, smallest to largest, a timeline written in hands. Oliver clapped. Now we're all part of the tree. Yes, Maggie said softly. I suppose we are. An awkward silence fell. Oliver, oblivious to the tension, had found a stick and was poking at something in the grass. Iris stood with her arms still wrapped around herself, and Maggie realized with a start that her daughter was afraid. Not of her, exactly, but of this moment, of what came next, of whether any of this could possibly be real. Would you like some tea? Maggie asked. The words came out stiff and formal, but they were something. A start. I don't know if that's a good idea, Iris said. Please. The word surprised Maggie as much as it seemed to surprise Iris. I know I have no right to ask. But please. Just tea. Just talking. That's all. Iris looked at Oliver, at the tree, at Ben, anywhere but at Maggie. Finally, she nodded. They walked to the house together, an odd procession. Oliver ran ahead, full of 6-year-old energy. Ben hung back, clearly uncomfortable with intruding on something so private. But when Maggie looked over her shoulder at him, he understood the plea in her eyes and followed. Inside, Maggie saw her house through Iris's eyes and felt shame wash over her. The dust. The cobwebs. The photographs turned face down on every surface. The sense of decay and abandonment that permeated every room. This had been Iris's childhood home, full of light and laughter and life. Now it was a mausoleum. It's exactly the same, Iris said, and Maggie couldn't tell if that was good or bad. Everything's in the same place. Even the furniture. I never saw the point in changing anything. Or cleaning anything, apparently. There was an edge to Iris's voice, familiar and painful. Maggie's first instinct was to snap back, to defend herself with cutting words. But she thought about the willow tree, about the way it had been dying from her grief, and she swallowed the sharp response. No, she said instead. I didn't see the point in that either. She made tea while Iris explored the house with Oliver, pointing out things from her childhood. Her old bedroom, still full of stuffed animals and books. The kitchen window where she used to watch for her father to come home. the living room where they'd put up the Christmas tree every year. Ben sat at the kitchen table, quiet and watchful. Maggie was grateful for his presence. He was a buffer, a witness, proof that this was really happening and not just another painful dream. When everyone gathered around the table, Maggie poured tea with shaking hands. Oliver had milk and cookies, which Maggie had miraculously found in the back of the pantry, not too stale. The boy chattered happily about his school and his friends and a lizard he'd caught last week and had to release because his mother said they couldn't keep it. Normal. It was all so devastatingly normal. Then Oliver said, "Grandma, why does Mommy's old room still have all her stuff in it? Doesn't anyone live there?" The table went silent. "No one lives there," Maggie said carefully. "I kept it the way it was, in case your mother wanted to come back someday. But she did come back. She came back today. I mean come back to stay." Oliver looked confused. "Why would she come back to stay? We have our own house." "Oliver," Iris said quietly, "drink your milk." But Oliver was 6 and persistent and didn't understand why everyone suddenly looked so sad. "Did you have a fight?" he asked. "Is that why Mommy never comes to visit?" Maggie and Iris looked at each other across the table. 20 years of silence hung between them like a curtain. "Yes," Maggie said. "We had a fight. A very bad one. And I said things I shouldn't have said. Things I've regretted every day since." "Did you say you were sorry?" "No. I never got the chance." "You have a chance now," Oliver pointed out with infallible child logic. Maggie's throat closed up. She looked at Iris and saw tears streaming silently down her daughter's face. Not the angry, hurt tears of their last encounter. Just tired tears. Sad tears. The tears of someone who'd carried something heavy for too long. "I'm sorry," Maggie whispered. "Iris, I'm so sorry. What I said to you, the way I treated you after your father died, there's no excuse. I was drowning in grief and I took you down with me. You were 17 years old and you needed a mother, and I failed you in every possible way." Iris wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You told me I was weak. That I disappointed you. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I was 17. I thought maybe you were right. Maybe I was weak. Maybe I was a disappointment. You weren't. You aren't. You were never those things. Then why did you say it?" Maggie took a shaky breath. This was the hardest part. The truth. "Because you looked like him," she said. "You had his eyes and his smile and his kindness, and every time I looked at you, I saw everything I'd lost. It hurt so much I couldn't breathe. And instead of dealing with my pain like an adult, like a mother should, I tried to make it stop by pushing you away. I thought if I could make myself stop loving you, it wouldn't hurt so much when you left too. So you drove me away on purpose." "Yes. And it's the worst thing I've ever done. Worse than anything I could possibly have done. Because you did leave, and it hurt anyway, but by then it was too late to take any of it back." Iris covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook. Oliver, frightened by his mother's tears, climbed into her lap and wrapped his arms around her neck. "Don't cry, Mommy," he said. "It's okay. Grandma said she's sorry." Ben quietly got up and motioned for Oliver to come with him. "Hey buddy, want to see some cool tools in my truck?" Oliver hesitated, looking between his crying mother and his newly discovered grandmother, then nodded and followed Ben outside. Alone with Iris, Maggie felt exposed in a way she hadn't felt in decades. No armor. No sharp words to hide behind. Just the truth, raw and painful. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Maggie said. "I don't even know if you should forgive me. What I did was unforgivable. But I need you to know that I've thought about you every single day. Wondered where you were. What you were doing. If you were happy. And I hoped, even though I had no right to hope, that maybe someday you'd come back so I could tell you how sorry I am." Iris lowered her hands. Her eyes were red, her face blotchy with tears. "I wanted to come back," she admitted. "So many times. I'd drive halfway here and then turn around because I was so afraid you'd say those things again. That you'd look at me with that cold expression and tell me I wasn't welcome. You were always welcome. This is your home." "It doesn't feel like home. It hasn't felt like home in 20 years. "Then let me make it feel like home again," Maggie said desperately. "I know I can't undo the past. I know I can't give you back those 20 years. But maybe, if you'll let me, I can try to be the mother I should have been all along." Iris laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Do you have any idea how many times I imagined this conversation? How many different ways I pictured it going? I imagine I was less pathetic in your versions. Actually, you were usually angrier, more defensive. I never imagined you'd just admit you were wrong." "I'm 72 years old," Maggie said. "I've spent 20 years being wrong. I'm tired of it." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, they could hear Ben and Oliver laughing about something. The sound of a child's laughter in this house was so strange, so foreign, that it made Maggie's chest ache. "Tell me about him," Maggie said finally. "About Oliver. About your life. I want to know everything." Iris hesitated, then slowly, carefully, began to talk. She told Maggie about meeting her husband, David, in college. About their wedding 3 years later. About Oliver's birth and how terrified she'd been, how sure she was that she'd be a terrible mother because she'd never had a good example. "But you weren't," Maggie said. "Terrible. You're wonderful with him. I can see it. I had to figure it out on my own. Every milestone, every challenge, I had no one to ask for advice. Do you know how many times I wanted to call you? To ask if this was normal or if I was doing it wrong or just to hear your voice. Why didn't you? Because I was afraid. And because I was angry. And because I'd convinced myself that you didn't care, that you were probably happy I was gone, that I was better off without you." Iris's voice broke. "But I wasn't better off. I needed my mother. Oliver needed his grandmother. We both needed you, and you weren't there." The words hit Maggie like physical blows. She deserved every one. "I'm here now," she said. It was inadequate, pathetically inadequate, but it was all she had. "I'm here now, and I want to be part of your lives. If you'll let me. If it's not too late." Iris looked at her for a long moment, and Maggie saw her daughter wrestling with something. Forgiveness wasn't simple. It wasn't a switch you could flip or a decision you could make in a single afternoon. It was complicated and messy and would probably take years to fully work through. But maybe they had years now. Maybe that was the point. "It's not too late," Iris said finally. "But it's not going to be easy either. I can't just forget 20 years. I can't pretend it didn't happen. I don't want you to. And you can't say things like that again. You can't be cruel when things get hard or when I remind you too much of Dad. If we're going to do this, you have to actually be here. Present. Kind. Like a real mother." "I can do that." Maggie's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "I will do that. I promise." Iris nodded slowly. Then, tentatively, she reached across the table and put her hand over Maggie's. It was the first time they'd touched in 20 years, except for that brief moment under the willow tree, and Maggie felt something fundamental shift in the universe. Outside, something miraculous was happening, though no one inside the house could see it yet. Ben had finished showing Oliver his tools, and they'd wandered back to the willow tree. Oliver was climbing on the lower branches, completely fearless, when Ben noticed something that made him stop and stare. The willow tree was covered in new growth. Not just a few scattered leaves, but everywhere, all at once, as if someone had fast-forwarded through an entire season in the space of an hour. Branches that had been bare and dead were suddenly green and vibrant. The fungus that had been eating away at the bark was gone, just gone, as if it had never been there. And the leaves were so green they almost glowed, rustling in a wind that didn't exist. What they? Ben whispered. Oliver climbed down and came to stand beside him. Wow, the tree looks different. It looks happy. Yeah, Ben said faintly. It does. He walked around the trunk, examining the bark, the branches, the roots. Everything was healthy. More than healthy. The tree was thriving in a way that shouldn't have been possible, not this fast, not all at once. Unless. Ben placed his hand on the trunk, right over the newly carved handprints, and listened. The whispers were there, but they'd changed. They weren't grieving anymore. They were singing. The tree had been dying from Maggie's grief, absorbing her pain year after year until it poisoned the roots. But now that pain was healing. Inside the house, mother and daughter were reconnecting, and the tree felt it. The tree knew. Love had always fed this tree. Joy and laughter and family, picnics and birthday parties and ordinary afternoons spent in the shade. That's what made it grow. And now, after 20 years of drought, after 20 years of slowly withering away, the love was coming back. The tree was responding the only way it knew how. By living. By choosing life over death. By growing. Oliver tugged on Ben's sleeve. Can we go tell Mommy and Grandma? They should see this. Ben nodded, still awestruck by what he was witnessing. They walked back to the house together, and when Ben knocked on the door, Maggie answered. She'd been crying, he could see that, but she was smiling too. A real smile, not the bitter twist of her lips he'd become accustomed to. You need to see something, Ben said. They all went outside, Maggie and Iris and Oliver and Ben, and stood together under the willow tree's canopy. Iris gasped. Maggie's hand flew to her mouth. How is this possible? Iris breathed. It was dying this morning. It was bare and sick and dying. It's not dying anymore, Ben said simply. Maggie walked up to the trunk and placed both hands flat against the bark. The tree was warm beneath her palms, alive and real and thriving. She thought about all the years she'd spent locked in her grief, letting everything around her decay. The house, the garden, the tree, herself. But grief wasn't permanent. Pain didn't have to last forever. Things could heal, if you let them. People could change, if they tried. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you got a second chance. Thank you, Maggie whispered to the tree. To Robert, wherever he was. To the universe. To Ben for writing those notes and finding Iris and refusing to let Maggie give up. Thank you. Oliver started climbing again, laughing as he swung from a branch. Iris stood beside her mother, and slowly, carefully, Maggie reached out and took her daughter's hand. Iris squeezed back. They stood like that for a while, 3 generations of the Fletcher family under the willow tree, plus Ben who'd somehow become part of this strange, healing moment. The leaves whispered overhead, and this time Maggie could hear what they were saying. Welcome home. Welcome home. Welcome home. Later, after Iris and Oliver had left with promises to come back next weekend, after Ben had packed up his tools and accepted payment for the job, Maggie stood alone in her kitchen and looked around at the dust and decay. Unacceptable, she muttered. She found cleaning supplies under the sink and got to work. She dusted and swept and scrubbed until her back ached and her hands were raw. She turned all the photographs right side up and really looked at them for the first time in years. Robert smiling at their wedding. Iris as a baby. The 3 of them under the willow tree, so happy it hurt to remember but hurt more to forget. She kept cleaning. She opened windows that hadn't been opened in years, letting fresh air chase away the staleness. She threw out dead flowers and old newspapers and the accumulated debris of 2 decades of giving up. It took her 3 days, working from morning until night, but finally the house looked like a home again. Not perfect, still worn in places, but clean. Lived in. Ready for visitors. Ready for family. On the 4th day, Ben came back to check on the tree. Maggie invited him in for tea, and they sat in the clean kitchen like civilized people. I need to pay you more, Maggie said. You already paid me. For the landscaping, yes. But not for what you really did. You gave me my daughter back. There's no amount of money that could cover that. Ben shifted uncomfortably. I just wrote some notes. You did more than that, and you know it. Maggie pushed an envelope across the table. It's not nearly enough, but it's what I can afford right now. I want you to use it to expand your business. Your father would be proud of what you're doing, carrying on his work. But he'd also want you to thrive, not just survive. Ben opened the envelope, and his eyes went wide. Mrs. Fletcher, I can't accept this. Yes, you can. And you will. Because I'm a stubborn old woman who's done enough damage in her life. I'd like to do some good for a change. Ben stared at the check, then at Maggie. Finally, he nodded. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. This will help more than you know. Good. Now, about the rest of the property. The garden is a disaster. Think you can fix it? Ben laughed. I can try. Try very hard. My grandson will be visiting regularly, and he should have a proper garden to play in. The way she said, my grandson, made Ben smile. There was wonder in her voice, and joy, and a fierce protectiveness that had probably always been there, just buried under years of grief. They talked about plants and layouts and projects, and for the first time in a very long time, Maggie felt something that might have been happiness. Not the overwhelming joy of her youth, not the simple contentment of her married years, but something quieter. Something earned. Hope. That weekend, Iris came back with Oliver and David, her husband. Maggie was nervous about meeting David, terrified he'd see her as the monster who'd hurt his wife, but he was kind and gracious and clearly loved Iris deeply. They had lunch under the willow tree, a real picnic with sandwiches and lemonade and cookies. Oliver ran around catching butterflies while the adults talked, really talked, about everything and nothing. David told stories about his work as a teacher. Iris shared photos of Oliver's school performances and birthday parties, 20 years of life that Maggie had missed but could witness now through pictures and stories. And Maggie told them about Robert, about their life together, the stories she'd kept locked away for so long. Oliver climbed into her lap and listened, wide-eyed, as she described his grandfather. The way Robert had built a tire swing for Iris and pushed her until she screamed with laughter. The way he'd sung terrible off-key songs while cooking dinner. The way he'd loved them all with his whole heart, until his heart gave out. He would have adored you, Maggie told Oliver, smoothing down his hair. He always wanted grandchildren. He would have spoiled you rotten. You can spoil me instead, Oliver said matter-of-factly, and everyone laughed. As the sun began to set, turning the sky pink and gold, they all carved their initials into the willow tree next to the handprints. MF and RF had been alone for so long, but now they were joined by IF, DM, and OM. A family tree in more ways than one. That night, after everyone had gone home, Maggie sat under the willow tree and listened to its whispers. They sounded like contentment now. Like peace. The tree had been dying because she'd been dying inside, but they were both healing now. Both choosing life. Thank you for waiting, Maggie whispered to the tree, to Robert, to whatever force in the universe had given her this second chance. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I'd given up on myself. The leaves rustled in response, and Maggie smiled. She'd spent 20 years alone, locked in her grief, letting everything around her decay. But that was over now. She had her daughter back. She had a grandson. She had a son-in-law and a friend in Ben and a willow tree that had taught her the most important lesson of all. Love doesn't die. Not really. It goes dormant sometimes, buried under pain and fear and all the ways we hurt each other. But it doesn't die. It waits, patient and stubborn, for the moment when we're finally brave enough to let it grow again. And when we do, when we finally let ourselves love and be loved, the whole world comes back to life. Maggie Fletcher was 72 years old, and for the first time in 20 years, she was happy. Not because her life was perfect, not because the past had been erased, but because she'd chosen to stop running from her pain and start healing from it instead. The willow tree stood tall and strong in the moonlight, its branches full of new life, its roots deep and sure. Carved into its trunk were the marks of 5 people who'd loved each other, hurt each other, lost each other, and found each other again. And the whispers in the leaves sang a simple truth, over and over, like a lullaby. You are not alone. You are not alone. You are not alone. Maggie listened, and believed, and finally, let herself rest.